Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be back in this hall. I think it's the first time I've been in this hall not wearing a gown, so I hope you won't think that I'm underdressed. Perhaps I can start with this point. When I was the last colonial oppressor in Hong Kong, the chancellor of every university. And when I arrived, I said to the then chief secretary, "This is ridiculous. First of all, I'm not going to remember what I have to wear at university congregations." But I was told that we'd put labels on all the gowns, so that was all right. I then said, "Why don't you let the university councils choose who they would like to have as their chancellor?" So the university councils were sounded out on the proposition. And the story came back that none of them trusted the others. They all thought that if I gave up theirs, somebody else would hold on to me. So I fetched up, I think I'm in the Guinness Book of Records for having given degrees to more undergraduates than any other human being ever has. I used to do all the university congregations, so I think it was 7 or 8 universities every year. Then I went back to the United Kingdom and became Chancellor of Newcastle University, which is a good research-based university. And then I was elected the Chancellor of Oxford University, the last election that I fought. The Chancellor of Oxford University is elected by all the graduates of the university. It's quite a good system. The downside is that you're elected for life. So when people say, "When you standing down?" I start thinking of funeral parlors. I do reply, or I used to reply, that I was the Chancellor for life, elected for life like the Pope and the Dalai Lama. I can't anymore say the Pope because Pope Benedict resigned. And I daren't say the Dalai Lama because of fear of what the Chinese embassy might say about it. But there it is. It's a fairly unique position. As far as responsibilities are concerned, the Vice-Chancellor actually runs the university, but as one of my predecessors used to say, if you didn't have a Chancellor, you couldn't have a Vice-Chancellor. So I'm largely ceremonial, as I was when I was Chancellor of this great university. And perhaps I can just begin by congratulating Hong Kong University and Hong Kong's universities as a whole on their standings in the international league tables. I think there are 2 Hong Kong universities in the world's top 50. There isn't one German university in the world's top 50. There isn't one French university in the world's top 50. There's one Swiss. So Hong Kong, with not a very large population, does fantastically well in higher education. And that, I think, should be something that people remember when they talk about the ability of people in Hong Kong to run their own affairs in the SAR. I'm not usually tongue-tied when I have to speak to people. But I really had some difficulty today in thinking what I should say to you. And I think that's because of principally 3 things. First of all, 2 years ago in 2014, when those extraordinary demonstrations, overwhelmingly peaceful, particularly until 1 or 2 triad groups were let loose, but overwhelmingly peaceful. When those things were happening, I noticed that the liaison office and other balanced, objective, witnesses to what was going on, said that it was all a disgraceful example of people in Hong Kong being manipulated by the CIA, by the British colonial power, the Grenadier Guards, Father Christmas. And I want to avoid today talking to you in a way which enables people in the next months or years to attack you on the grounds that you've been put up to this by outsiders. So I'm not going to risk giving you strong advice, which you'd anyway probably not take. But I'll say what I think is right, and I'll give my opinion about the situation today with the frustration of your concerns to play a bigger part in determining your own futures. The second point I want to make is a very obvious one. I'm not a citizen of Hong Kong. I'm an outsider who loves this city more than anywhere else that I've ever lived. In my last policy address in 1996, I quoted a passage from the American author Jack London. He was a real socialist. If I can put it this way, he was a socialist with socialist attributes. And Jack London wrote a passage which I quoted in that address, and I was reminded of it because somebody I very much admire gave me in Chinese calligraphy the entire quotation, which she had written out in a beautiful hand. "I'd rather be ashes than dust," Jack London wrote. "I'd rather my spark should die out in a brilliant blaze, that it should be stifled in dry rot. I'd rather be a superb meteor with every atom of me in magnificent glow than a sleepy and permanent planet." Hong Kong for me was like that. And it was made up of people like you, of your mothers and fathers, grandparents, many of whom were refugees from some of the most dramatic events in the 20th century. People who made out of this city a phenomenal success story. What did Hong Kong have to offer? A port. What else did Hong Kong have to offer? The extraordinary resilience of human beings, many of whom swam to get here, clambered over barbed wire, came here and worked in freedom, and created this astonishing city. So Hong Kong is special to me, and I think you'd be surprised how special it is to people all around the world. I've never been anywhere where people didn't speak in that sort of way about Hong Kong. The third reason for me being slightly cautious about what I say today, why I'm a little bit reticent to be too rhetorical, is that I'm the past, not the future. I came here, as I've been discovering, before most of you were born. I came here, I suspect, before some of your mothers and fathers were courting. So I'm the past, not quite as past as the Great Wall of China, but I'm history. It's you that's going to make the future. And you that's going to make the future by continuing to believe in the sort of values which have made people happier and more stable and less mean all around the world. When I sailed out of the harbor in 1997, I think I left behind the institutions of a free society living under the rule of law. I always thought that Hong Kong was one of the freest cities or societies in Asia. Much freer than some which allegedly were democratic. Hong Kong was described in the best book by an academic on different sorts of government as the only society he could think of which was liberal and free but not democratic. All the software, all the hardware of a free society, except the ability to elect your own government, and that you should have had. I've never pretended that I'm other than slightly ashamed of the fact that the British colonial power didn't do more to establish the foundations of democracy here in Hong Kong. I was turned into a sort of democratic hero by the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party, simply for trying to ensure that elections here were free and fair. I didn't do as much for democracy as some of the politicians who perhaps you're a bit too critical of these days. Martin and Emily and Jung Sum and the others. They really were brave about it. And you were brave in 2014. You've had to be much braver than I've ever been in making the case for democracy. When we left, though, we left behind the Sino-British Joint Declaration, not the Chinese Declaration, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an international treaty lodged at the United Nations. And we left behind the Basic Law, which tried to implement that joint declaration. And what that joint declaration promised was gradual progress towards full suffrage for men and women. And that steady progress was promised absolutely explicitly. And I'm going to do something now which I don't regularly do, which is to read out a passage from the People's Daily. The method of universal suffrage should be reported to China's parliament for the record, whereas the central government's agreement is not necessary. How Hong Kong develops its democracy in the future is completely within the sphere of the autonomy of Hong Kong. The central government will not interfere. The head of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office in 1993 reported in the People's Daily, so it must be true. That was confirmed the following year by the Foreign Minister in 1994. 2016, where is it? "20 years on from the departure of British colonialism, 20 years on from that, I can understand your frustration and that of many of your parents, and I can understand why that's boiled over. And I understand as well how limited were a lot of the things you were asking for in 2014. I simply can't understand why nobody saw the point of trying to work for reconciliation and consensus. I can't see why nobody was prepared to talk about, for example, even if not going as far as you thought you were entitled for them to go. I can't understand why nobody was prepared to talk about how you could make the selection committee more representative. Representative today of 7.5% of the people of Hong Kong. I can't understand why nobody was prepared to talk about whether the functional constituencies should continue in their present shape, whether more directly elected seats should be allowed. I don't think any of that would have been too damaging or dangerous, except maybe to one or two people's amour propre. So in 2014, the world watched what happened in Hong Kong in awe. I'd never seen anything like that before. I'd seen demonstrations which ended in appalling violence. I was in Tiananmen Square until a week before what a friend of the Communist Party in Hong Kong used to call the kerfuffle in Tiananmen Square. So I'd seen demonstrations which moved from being a sort of festival of democracy into violence, not provoked by the people in the square. But I'd never seen anything as brilliantly and capably and decently organized. When had anybody in Western Europe or America, when had anybody seen demonstrators helping one another with their homework? When had they ever seen demonstrators with litter bags to clear up after them? People don't do that, for heaven's sake, after football matches. You won something which I think you underestimate. I think you won the moral high ground. If I can sound like a boring old 72-year-old, moral high ground may not seem to you to be very significant. But I've never had a position on the moral high ground that was internationally recognized in the way that it was for you. So you'll forgive me that a few months ago, when some students from Hong Kong came to see me in Oxford, where I regularly talk to students like this, if I said that I thought it was a grave mistake to move on from a campaign for democracy to which you are entitled to call for independence. Let me just pause for a moment on to which you are entitled. The second time I came into this hall was in 1992 in December. And I was chairman as the Chancellor. I was wearing my kit. I was chairman of a lecture which was given by the then Senior Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. I'd met him on my way to Hong Kong. He'd written to me afterwards saying, I think we should be on Harry and Chris terms. And when I made some proposals about how to try to ensure that the elections here were free and fair, he wrote me a letter. It'll appear in public one day. He wrote me a letter saying he thought I'd very imaginatively filled in all the gaps in the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration. But then the trumpets blasted outside the walls of, well, not Jericho, but Hong Kong. And he decided that that wasn't the case at all, that I'd sinned against the Communist Party of China. And he came for this lecture, and he gave rather a boring lecture, actually. But then the first question from somebody down there, not somebody down there today, but somebody sitting down there. The first question was, does Hong Kong deserve democracy? And he pulled out a great sheaf of notes from his pocket, much longer than his lecture had been. And he proceeded to tell an audience as big as this that maybe Hong Kong deserved democracy, but you didn't always get what you deserved. Life wasn't like that, and Hong Kong couldn't get it. Well, Hong Kong does deserve democracy, and Hong Kong was promised democracy. It was promised democracy in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the third paragraph of which talks about the territorial integrity of China and the SAR and of national unity. I can't argue the case for the Joint Declaration and for the things it promised and take no notice of that stipulation. And none of your friends in the world outside are going to do that. What's happened is that instead of having Chinese officials, mainland communist officials, who have to answer your arguments about democracy, they're now able to denounce a campaign for independence for Hong Kong. Another example of splitism. And people in China who didn't see any signs, who weren't shown the television of 2014, are told you can bet your bottom dollar about the terrible splitism of these spoiled kids in Hong Kong. It's madness to risk that moral high ground. It's madness to allow other people to twist and distort an argument which you are going to win by introducing a subject where you're not going to win. It fractures your support. It means that people who would be queuing up to continue to support what you're saying and doing are reluctant to do so. I think the argument should be about how you can build more bridges between yourselves and others, how you can build greater support. Not by denouncing the people on whose shoulders you're climbing. It's crazy to forget about the efforts that were made by Democrats in the past. You may not think they have achieved as much as you would have liked them to have achieved, but you really can't dismiss them and dismiss their efforts out of hand. So please don't fracture and break up what is a mighty, powerful argument. So what do you do next? There's a wonderful article which you can look up. It's gin and tonic, don't worry. Thanks very much. He put more gin in. There's a wonderful article which you can look up on the internet by somebody called Adam Gopnik, Gopnik, written in the New Yorker. Somebody who's devastated by the threat which he thinks President-elect Trump represents to his view of what liberal democracy should mean. And the sort of advice he gives to his friends about how they should behave is the sort of advice which I think you'd find quite sensible. He talks about building not just around public politics, but about constructing for yourselves a space for your values, for your ideas, and for your notions of what society should be like. And he finishes with a line which summarizes really all that any of us can do. He says, all we can do is all we can do. So, sometimes I'm asked what I want for students at Oxford. And I guess what I want for students at Oxford is much the same as what I want for students at Hong Kong. I want you to be able to live the sort of life which suits your interests, your values. I guess I want you to live a life in which you can explore your attributes to the full, a life in which you can talk about politics or not, in which when you talk about politics, you're not afraid of people overhearing what you're saying, in which you can be rude and make jokes about the government when it deserves it, in which you can go to political rallies or go to church or go to the horse races, and nobody interferes with you, in which when you take out your iPad and open it up, you can get the same apps in Hong Kong that you could get in Britain or America. So I want a world in which you show, contrary to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, not just how much you deserve democracy, but how well you're going to handle democracy. I believe that will happen. I believe that your aspirations represent the future, not the past. And when will it happen? Well, I'd love to be able to say in my lifetime, but I'm 72 and I mustn't assume, but it'll certainly happen in your lifetime. Be confident of that. It'll be happen in your lifetime if you're sensible about it and principled enough about it and committed enough about it and wise enough about the way you go about it. I repeat, the image that you provided in 2014 was one of the most impressive things I have ever seen in my public life or in my private life. So, if I'm still around, invite me back here when mass suffrage has made Hong Kong an even more moderate, sensible, and successful city than it is now. And it's much easier talking here without having to wear a gown. So thank you very much.